Welcome, Mikkel Kallesoe. I hope I pronounced this correctly. He's an advisor at Shell currently, but it has been given away a little bit. He's got a past in IUCN. He's seconded at Shell now, which is a good thing in many respects, of course. Before joining Shell earlier this year, Mikkel was Ecosystems Program Manager at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, well known, where he led the development of the Corporate Guide to Ecosystem Valuation and became an editor and author of the T for Business report. Thank you and welcome, Mikkel.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I'm not sure. I think Chris was saying he's the odd one. I'm probably just as odd, I guess, in this gathering, which I find is a little bit of a pity because I do think a lot of business should actually be here and hear where science is and what's where it has evolved to. But yeah, as Leon said, I'm seconded from IUCN to Shell, so I'm not really Shell, as and also. This clearly states that I am probably the only one from business who, by legal department, has to put in a cautionary note like this. So basically, anything I say should not reflect back on necessarily being the official opinion of the company. So, but what I wanted to just briefly touch upon is where is Shell in terms of its biodiversity commitment, in terms of its biodiversity manuals and guidance, and then to look a little bit around, what is sort of the external landscape saying to business, including Shell, around ecosystem services, and that's the primary focus of my work within Shell, is to figure out what does ecosystem services as a concept mean for the company. Then I'll talk a little bit about what Shell has been doing, which is the work I've been leading, as well as what are some of the other broader industry groups actually doing around ecosystem services, because business is paying attention to this topic. And then finally end off with a few challenges as I see them of moving science into practice within the business community. So in 2003, Shell, they made their biodiversity commitments as you see them on the slide here. They are the only oil and gas company to actually have a no-go commitment into UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They had hoped back then, when with IUCN this commitment was developed, that other oil and gas companies would follow. Unfortunately, they have not, contrary to the mining sector, where the ICMM actually have a commitment like this. Now one of the problems with that then obviously is that as you get into a World Heritage Site and some governments then actually do allow for exploration, Shell loses out on the competitive advantage. So as Krista was saying, that's one of the triggers of how you get business interested in this. But if they cannot go in and then another company goes in, it doesn't really have any difference on conservation outcomes, but it might have an impact on Shell's bottom line. Also, there is a commitment towards what Shell has defined as areas of high biodiversity value. They include IUCN categories 1 through 4, Ramsar sites, Natura 2000 sites, important bird areas, and a few others. If they operate within one of those, they have to develop a biodiversity action plan. There is also a commitment to publicly report on the work that they do in one of those IUCN 1 through 4 protected areas, as well as through their various partnerships with conservation NGOs like IUCN, Earthwatch, the Nature Conservancy, the Smithsonian Institute, and Wetlands International, to actually help and work towards conservation as well. Besides having to do a biodiversity action plan for any project Shell does, obviously they have to do an impact assessment. Now that's often driven by regulatory requirements. Now looking at sort of what's going on outside, and a lot of this has been presented over the last 3 days as well, is that clearly there are a number of external drivers. There's more attention in public policy and regulation. We've heard Laurie talk about the new EU biodiversity 2020 strategy. We have the Archie targets coming out of the CBD. We have the TEEB rollout now with all the different country-level ecosystem assessments. We have the setup of the IPBES. There's a lot of momentum going on around the world on how governments and civil society are trying to deal with this. There's an increased stakeholder expectation that business steps up to the plate and actually starts integrating ecosystem services. There are now more rigorous lending requirements that specifically put an emphasis on ecosystem services. Here I'm thinking about the new performance standards that will come into force January next year from the International Finance Corporation, the IFC. Again, their ecosystem services is not referenced in relation to having to do offsets and achieve no net loss around critical habitats, but it is a key requirement in your impact assessment that you do integrate these considerations now. Also, it's becoming an increasing part of environmental management. ISO is picking up on this. Interestingly enough, the new ISO 26000 series, which is not a it's a guidance, it's a guideline, but it's around social responsibility. But that's where ecosystem services is actually referenced. Also, I think just earlier this week, WRI released a new report on how they're going to try and expand their biodiversity indicators to also have some specifically around ecosystem services. So there's a lot going on. And obviously from a business perspective, you know, every company impacts and depends on ecosystem services. As we know, trend is not looking so good. The supply of these ecosystem services is going down. Obviously that does create risks or opportunities for a company depending on how they choose to respond to that. Now, again, it's very difficult to slice it across all sectors of business. Different sectors will have different levels of dependence and impacts. So some of the stuff that I've been looking at within Shell and trying to figure out, well, what does the concept of ecosystem services actually mean, and what appears to be the benefit of actually taking such an approach, and that be specifically around risk management as well as impact assessment. Yeah. So we're looking at, you know, some of the hypotheses is that an ecosystem services-based approach can actually facilitate better alignment between environmental performance and social responsibility. It can help identify cumulative impacts, feedback loops, and some of the unintended consequences very early on in project design and management. The integration of ecosystem service dependence in risk management. Here I'm thinking specifically about two things. One, the company dependence itself, which is often omitted from traditional impact assessments, as well as the dependence of other stakeholders on ecosystem services. So that goes to the next point, figuring out who are the stakeholders that actually depend and use these ecosystem services, and what are the trade-offs. It can support a view of integrated land use management, as well as the economic policies, the development policies of a country. Help with the stakeholder identification, again based on the use of ecosystem services, as well as enhanced engagement, and ultimately sort of, I believe, drive a company to have a more of a proactive approach to health, safety, and environment risk management, rather than a compliance-driven sort of reactive approach to this. So what's going on outside where Shell and myself were also involved? The IPECA, which is the business association for oil and gas companies, as well as the OGP, they've just released a new ecosystem service guideline, which is basically a checklist that helps identify the main ecosystem service dependencies and impacts, and how you should try and manage the associated risks and opportunities. And it sort of tries to visually illustrate how this then complements a traditional impact assessment. There's also work done by BSR, that's another business association, looking at, well, how do we actually facilitate the integration of ecosystem services into an integrated assessment, an environmental social impact assessment. and is there a difference from the way it's currently being done? Then we have the World Resources Institute that have developed the Corporate Ecosystem Services Review. Again, one of those tools out there that is specifically referenced, for example, also in the IFC, New Performance Standards. And it's a 5-step structured methodology to help a business manager go through the identification of their impacts, dependence on ecosystem services, a trends analysis of how the provision of services will change over time, and how that then translates into risks and opportunities, as well as come up with some suggestions of how a company might, at the strategic level, try and respond to this. Is it to, for example, engaging policymakers? Is it by making internal changes? Or is it by reaching out to your peers in your sector and raising the bar as a whole? Finally, there is also the World Business Council for Sustainable Development that just earlier this year released their Guide to Corporate Ecosystem Evaluation, which builds on what WRI has done, but really tries to present environmental evaluation from a business perspective. So finally, just a few challenges, I think, or maybe even barriers that sort of hinder business in probably moving quicker on this. I think there is, even though there is a lot of movement and a lot of stuff going on in the regulatory and legislative environment, it's still not that consistent, especially if we think about non-OECD countries. Obviously, the US and the EU are way ahead of many countries in Asia, in Africa, and South America. Also, the fact being that external stakeholders have very different perspectives on what this means and why it's important and what priority it should have. For Shell specifically, also most of their assets and projects are run as joint ventures where they might not necessarily hold the majority of the stake of the shares. That might actually be on the hands of national oil and gas companies. So again, you often find yourself having, and being in a bit of dilemma of saying, well, if Shell has their global policy around biodiversity, etc., can they impose that standard on others that might not have that, but might be at a lower level? So that obviously does create some challenges. Also, I think as we've heard over the last 3 days, the metrics for measurement and prioritization needs a lot more work. There's a lot of stuff going on at the national level, but everyone is sort of developing their own methodology, their own types of indicators. So again, for a company like Shell, to say adopt a global standard around this is very, very difficult, because what is the global standard? So obviously the fallback strategy for them is, as long as we comply with what national regulation tells us to do, that's where we'll start. Also, it's still a very new concept within business. I think a lot of companies have just sort of learned to deal with biodiversity, and now they're hearing ecosystem services, which is quite frightening to many of them. And capacity is limited. Again, for a company like Shell, when they do impact assessments, that's often subcontracted out to big consultancies, who also, again, don't necessarily have the expertise or experience in integrating ecosystem services. They are often just making their case by saying, how can we cheapest make sure that the company gets the license to operate? And that then reflects back on what's required by national regulation, which often is not necessarily doing an integrated assessment. Sometimes you just need to do an environmental one. Sometimes you need to do an environmental as well as a social one. But very seldom do they actually call for an integrated one throughout. So even though it might come up as one document, often these are basically just stapled together and developed by different discipline teams without really understanding the integration, which I think is one of the biggest benefits that the ecosystem services approach sort of has to offer. So I think, within most businesses as well as within Shell, the real value add of an ES-based approach is that it actually helps facilitate systems thinking, a holistic view to integration, and tries to break down some of the barriers that we have around environmental and social impact assessments, measurements, and risk. Also, one of the things that we sort of looked at within Shell when sort of piloting an ecosystem services approach at the asset level is that it does not always make sense. There are some triggers in my mind of when it does make sense to do this. If we're just looking at one single well pad, which has a very, very limited footprint, it might not be that necessary to do this. But some of the things that we have sort of identified is sort of four main criteria or triggers that would sort of where it would seem to make sense to look more in detail on ecosystem services. One is that you have a very large footprint, very large impact, that there's a large dependence by the company on ecosystem services and or by surrounding stakeholders in areas of high biodiversity value, and finally where there is a high likelihood or risk of cumulative impacts. So I think I'll end with that. Thank you very much.